The fact that yoga is also followed by many who are not Hindu does not change the fact that it is a vital Hindu practice. Let's draw a parallel to the popular meditative technique of vipassana. The practice of vipassana by non-Buddhists does not lessen the fact that it is a Buddhist practice, not just a practice with origins in Buddhism. Next, let's look at the question, can the followers of the world's many religions all benefit from the practice of yoga? Certainly, in many cases, the followers of the religions are already convinced that this is true. Take, for example, the statement in the August 2009 Newsweek article, "We're all Hindus now." The article quotes the view of Stephen Protero, religion professor at Boston University, on the American propensity for the divine deli cafeteria religion. He states, "You're not picking and choosing from different religions because they're all the same. It isn't about orthodoxy. It's about whatever works. Going to yoga works, great. And if going to Catholic Mass works, great. And if going to Catholic Mass plus the yoga plus the Buddhist retreat works, that's great too." However, it's also true that the leaders of some religions have spoken out strongly against the practice of yoga by their followers. For example, over the years, the Vatican has issued a number of warnings to Catholics about yoga. 1989, the Vatican warned, meditation practices such as Zen and yoga can degenerate into a cult of the body that debases Christian prayer. The love of God, the sole object of Christian contemplation, is a reality which cannot be mastered by any method or technique. More recently, in 2008, the leading Islamic council in Malaysia issued an edict prohibiting the country's Muslims from indulging in the practice of yoga, fearing its Hindu roots could corrupt them. The council's chairman, Abdul Shukur Husim, explained the decision. "We are of the view that yoga, which originates in Hinduism, combines a physical exercise, religious elements, chanting and worshiping for the purpose of achieving inner peace and ultimately to be at one with God. For us, yoga destroys a Muslim's faith." There are other ways to get exercise. You can go cycling, swimming, and eat less fatty food, he says. In searching the web, another informative example turned up. In 2006, the Reverend Richard Fair, the vicar of St. Mary's Church in Henham, England, took a decision that made him the talk of the Essex village. He banned a 16-strong group of yoga enthusiasts from taking lessons in his church hall. Yoga is, he said, an unchristian practice. For some people, it is simply an exercise. It is also often a gateway into other spiritualities, including Eastern mysticism. The Christian and Muslim examples we use state no concerns about the practice of yoga resulting in conversion to Hinduism. However, our three examples all express the concern that yoga practice is inconsistent with the tenets of their respective religions. Chairman Husim states the concern succinctly. Yoga destroys a Muslim's faith. This naturally raises a question as to what are the tenets of yoga. To answer this question, let's look at the statements on the website of one of the most famous modern teachers of yoga, BKS Iyengar. His system, known as Iyengar Yoga, is quite popular. There's thousands of teachers listed on his website, and more than 60 of them are here in Victoria. It's quite a few. His website's first frequently asked question is, what is yoga? The answer given is, yoga is one of the 6 systems of Indian philosophy. The word originates from the Sanskrit root yuj, which means union. On the spiritual plane, it means union of the individual self with the universal self. Yoga is the union of the body, mind, and emotions and intellect. Sage Patanjali penned down this subject in his treatise known as Yoga Sutras. Clearly, it is not a specific practice, such as chanting the mantra Om, that makes yoga Hindu. Rather, it is the philosophy itself, independent of what is practiced. The fact that the goal of yoga philosophy is a mystical experience, a mystical experience of the oneness of the soul with God, is what makes it inherently Hindu. In conclusion, for those followers of religions where unity mysticism is an unacceptable belief, the practice of yoga is also likely to be unacceptable to their religious leaders. However, for those in more liberal religions as well as those with no formal religious affiliation, yoga is definitely a practice that can benefit one physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Thank you very much.
Please welcome Professor Chris Chappell.
I stand before you as a person of yoga, and I was trained by a woman from Calcutta, Gurani Anjali, and I began residence in this ashram on Long Island in 1972 and continued with that residency in this community until 1985. And I continue the study and practice and life of yoga in all the years since. And as part of my wife and I, our training, we helped operate a bookstore, a restaurant, and for 6 years I served as pujari in the ashram. And simultaneously, we both pursued our graduate degrees, and what I would like to share with you today is a little reflection on how yoga manages its rather elusive inclusivity. In other words, how does this theology work? And I'm going to be going quite quickly because we only have a few minutes here, but I'm going to be putting out some Sanskrit terms that you will not see, but if you would like more details, I can talk to you afterwards. So I want to first lift up two terms from Patanjali. One of them is Ishtadevata, which is a suggestion by Patanjali that you have a choice in terms of how you want to conceptualize the deity that will be most useful for you. And furthermore, he goes on with another phrase called Dhyanad Abhimatava, which says that you need to follow the meditation that you want to follow. And he never specifies what that must be. When he talks about guru, he talks about the fact that all of the gurus, all of the teachers have learned from this entity called Ishvara, which is about the closest that we get to an idea of God. And he further goes on to say that this God has never, ever been tainted by karma, has never entered into the realm, therefore, of Prakriti. So therefore, this God has never had any qualities. But yet, it's that God that is the teacher of all who have been teachers. So again, the elusive nature is to not name a specific deity. I also want to sort of explode the myth that there is one faith that can own yoga or can own Patanjali. And I want to lift up, first of all, Jainism, and point out that in three significant ways, the list of yamas, ahimsa, satya, steya, brahmacharya, aparigraha, those are borrowed in straight from the Acharanga Sutra of Jainism, which predates Patanjali by probably at least around 500 years. Likewise, the discussion of karma and the colors that are used to describe karma are not found other than in the earliest layers of Indian philosophy. They're described thusly in the Jain literature. And the term that Patanjali uses for the goal and the culmination of yoga, kaivalyam, is a term also that was familiar within India in a Jain context. And then the Buddhists. Okay, from the Buddhists, Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, Upeksha, these beautiful descriptions of how to live the enlightened life are borrowed in from Buddhist scripture, as are these terms savitarka, nirvitarka, savichara, nirvichara. The Satipatthana Sutra of the Buddha describes the subtilization processes that take place in the practices of meditation that Patanjali himself lifts up. That's from the Theravada tradition. And from the Mahayana tradition, we have the 10th Bodhisattva Bhumi is Dharma Mega Samadhi. And Dharmamegha Samadhi is another way of talking about Kaivalya. And then another aspect where we see the beautiful theology of Buddhism incorporated is the repeated use by Patanjali of the word shunya, that we need to bring ourselves to this place of emptiness, and this emptiness is how he goes on to describe Kaivalya, how he goes on to describe Samadhi. Patanjali makes no mention of Brahman. He makes no mention of a specific God. He makes no mention of a creator God, nor does he really ever talk about union with God. What he talks about is this state, this blessed state, where the dissolution takes place of any distinction between grasper, grasping, and grasped. And that's as far as he goes in talking about the state that we would call samapati, that he called samapati, that we would translate as unity. His inclusivity is brilliant, radiant, and it's due to what he does not state rather than what he actively posits. Now, Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga became the gold standard for describing yoga in later Indian traditions. And I want to lift up a scholar called Haribhadra Suri, who lived in the 8th century, and he gives us a little snapshot of how this frame that Patanjali put forward energized the philosophers of India. And he describes 3 different systems of Eightfold Yoga. One is a Vedanta Yoga put forward by a scholar called Bhagavad Datta, and he uses as his description Satmikurta Pravritti for samadhi, the notion that you join with that eternal self that we hear of in the Upanishads. Then he talks about another yoga, a Buddhist yoga, that he ascribes to a Buddhist scholar called Bhaskara. And at that level of samadhi for Bhaskara, he names it asanga, which means that you detach yourself from all things. And then for himself, and he lived, Haribhadra Suri, in the 8th century, and he lived at a time when Tantra was extremely popular and when the worship of the goddess was at its ascendancy. And what he did was he argued in this very fascinating text that everything that those Tantrikas have, we have also in our way of thinking about yoga, in our way of thinking about meditation. And he refers to samadhi as Para, who is the goddess of this blessed state. Later, 300 years later, another Jain scholar, Hemachandra, wrote the Yoga Shastra, where he again uses that eightfold frame to explicate and to explain the power and the beauty and focuses of yoga and focuses primarily on pranayama. And then as we move further into the more Hindu expressions of yoga in the middle period of India's history, religious history, we have Lord Chaitanya lifting up that aspect of mantra that we find described within Patanjali. We find Abhimanyu even earlier than Lord Chaitanya, talking about Om Namah Shivaya, talking about that radiant consciousness, but again, giving it a theological flavor that attaches these practices of yoga to specific deities, Lord Krishna, Lord Rama in the case of the Vaishnavas, and of course, Lord Shiva for the Shaivas. And I wanted to say that within even these more sectarian ways of practicing yoga, in the Yoga Vasishta, we just saw a little picture of the Yoga Vasishta. I've just completed a translation from the Yoga Vasishta of a description of a sevenfold yoga. And in the sevenfold yoga, the beginning phases of this beautiful practice are, first of all, addressing the big questions in life and saying that life, I don't really want to live in this world of stale karmas anymore. And there's a turning away from attachment, a turning away from the common conventional life and what a state that is called nivritti. And then there's a taking up of practice called vicharana. And from this vicharana, we move into a state of asamsanga, a state where you're no longer attached. And from that, you can move through the world as if everything is a dream. And then through your deep dream experiences, your karmas automatically dispel. And then the Yoga Vasishta, famous for its description of the Jivan Mukta, says that then you can live as a liberated being. And then it finally says, but when you die, do you go to Brahman? Do you go to Purusha? Do you go to Shiva? We don't know. So multiple lineages. We saw images of Mr. Iyengar, briefly of Mr. Bikram, so many different ways and paths of doing yoga. And what has the response been in America has been to offer a registry so that we have a very loose standard that guarantees that if you go to a Yoga Alliance certified person, they will have had 200 hours of some sort of training in yoga. And this is sort of the beauty of yoga, is that it evades skillfully, deftly. It evades with a very considered method being put in anybody's box. And I just want to talk briefly about the work that I've brought forward in Los Angeles in establishing what was mentioned before, our various yoga philosophy and yoga therapy and yoga in ecology and Vinyasa Krama certification programs. And I also want to point out that these are all being done within the context of a Jesuit Roman Catholic university. And I've just, in fact, been asked by the administrators at my university to develop a plan to do an MA for the training of professional yoga teachers. And I think that this speaks to the fact that all religions at heart have a fairly big heart. And I want to just give a little bit of my mission statement here, the mission statement that we're developing, that we're seeking to provide sound training to ensure the transmission of a tradition that stays true to its roots of encouraging spiritual growth, an elevation of conscience, and a cultivation of love and respect for all beings from all walks of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please welcome Suhag Shukla.
Namaste. So the initial question, is yoga truly a universal practice that can be engaged in by people of all religions or none without compromising their beliefs? And I'm trained as a lawyer, and throughout our legal training, we are taught to see both sides of an issue. And that is because the potential of both sides or both answers that you may come to, or multiple answers, is that they both, or however many answers you have, that they all can potentially be true. And in the way that I answer this question, I answer yes and no because I truly believe that they both are true. Hindu roots, yoga is rooted within Hinduism. And I guess in responding respectfully to Professor Chappell, he pointed out that there is not the use of the term Brahman, or there aren't the other references that you find throughout the Vedas or the Agamas, which are the foundation of Hindu philosophy and Hindu thought. However, earlier today, I attended a meditation class with Bodhinathji, and Palaniswami explained how in Hawaii, where their monastery is, that there are multiple words to describe waves. Why? Because as an island, you have water around you, and it's a prevalent feature. And in that same very way, within the Hindu context, where the Vedas rightly state, ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti, that the truth is one and the paths are many, naturally we're going to have very many different names for the divine. And so while Patanjali may have used certain words to perhaps today in our analysis say that it is independent of its Hindu roots, I have to disagree. Because yoga is inherent in the spiritual practices of Hindus. But whether it's exclusive to Hindus is a question that we're here to answer. And Hinduism, as a pluralistic, non-exclusivist tradition, is open to all. They carry eternal truths. They've described the eternal truths and techniques and methodologies for which we all can benefit and gain that union with the one divine. But whether all people can benefit from yoga is a question that comes to where these people, all of us, are coming from. If we belong to a religious tradition that requires us to reject certain beliefs, a belief in karma, or a belief of the existence of the divine within us, then you may very well compromise your religious beliefs. However, compromise is not necessarily a bad thing, because no matter what yoga it is, whether it's Ashtanga yoga, Bhakti yoga, Jnana yoga, all of those things are allowing us to not just believe in God, but to know God. And so while you may compromise certain religious beliefs, it's not necessarily going to take you away. It will take you away from doctrine, perhaps, but it brings you to something deeper and more meaningful. However, if you find belief to be meaningful for you, then perhaps yoga is not a path that one should pursue. What we find in the West is a delinking of yoga from yoga and Hinduism. If you go to any yoga studio, well, not any yoga studio, but many of the yoga studios in the United States, they will specifically and adamantly say that yoga has nothing to do with Hinduism. And what is the problem with this? As a second-generation Hindu American, it's an appropriation of a tradition that we're born into or that we find ourselves drawn to. And the problem with this is that it leaves Hinduism stripped of a very deep spiritual heritage. It leaves Hinduism to be understood as caste, cows, curry, sati, dowry. The list goes on, and I think that we all are familiar with those things. It also leaves just the ritual aspects of Hinduism, which the ritual aspects of Hinduism are empty without this spiritual base. So in terms of the question, is it a covert conversion? And some of the concerns that other religious traditions have expressed, it only becomes covert when you de-link the roots of yoga, the Hindu roots of yoga, from what yoga is. But as I mentioned before, we can all benefit from these teachings. What we see in the United States, okay, thank you. In many magazines, we see, I'll quote from here, classical yogic texts such as Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita. What we see is that the Bhagavad Gita is now a yogic text. Again, this is an example where if enough people repeat something, it becomes true. We're talking about one of the most sacred texts that Hindus worldwide turn to in their times of need, in their times of searching, in their personal journeys. There's another quote. There are examples of this in all devotional traditions. This is in relation to devotion, loving devotion to God. And the magazine says, mystical Christianity, Judaism, and Sufism, and especially in the Bhakti tradition of India. So as we see these periodicals, we see an intentional leaving out of the term Hindu. And so this delinking then all of a sudden makes the word Hindu a bad word. In the long term, in the long scheme of things, whether it impacts our personal journeys and whether we label it as Hindu or not is not of consequence. But for millions around the world who face hate speech, who face bigotry, who face human rights violations, who are relegated to a definition of their religious traditions that don't come from their perspective, but the outside perception that equates it with social evils or with practices that have been rejected by other major world traditions, relegates Hinduism to a second-class status among world religions. we were specifically told when we contacted some of these yoga magazines, why does it seem that, or is there an intentional avoidance of the term Hindu? And the answer that I received was yes, because Hinduism has too much baggage. And that's something that's concerning to us. If Hinduism, if the ancient rishis, on the foundation of a belief of the existence of the divine within each of us, in the belief of karma, in the concept of rebirth and having many, many opportunities to grow spiritually, to attain oneness with the divine, if yoga is rooted on this foundation, the very foundation of Hindu philosophy, alongside the fact that it does not require you to shun the religion of your birth. It does not require you to pick a particular Ishtadevta or pledge allegiance to a particular god. It doesn't require you to have been born in a specific geographic area. Then it is open to all, and it does not require any conversion. But if you're from that religious tradition that says, no, this is how you have to believe, do not be dissuaded by thoughts of the divine being within you, but that the divine is above us all, then you may compromise your religious beliefs. Thank you.